So my name is Jeff Cacy, and I'm going to talk to you today about Alaska Airlines. And I was with Alaska Airlines for multiple decades, and this is a story that starts in the present day, and I take you back to 91 years ago in 1932, and then work back to the present. I would like to introduce Robert Kanayurak, who also works for Alaska Airlines in Anchorage, and he's going to help me out a little bit with the presentation. I think you all got the first handout, which is the route map of Alaska Airlines today. What this slide shows you is Alaska Airlines, and it's one of its larger hubs, San Francisco, and that sort of is the preamble to what's going on today. So this is the airline, this is who we are today, the 5th largest airline in the United States, the 15th airline in the world by revenue, which is very, very large. Nearly $10 billion in annual revenues, almost 42 million passengers annually, 120 cities served, more than 300 aircraft in the fleet, 1,200 flights a day, 23,000 employees, 5 major hubs, Seattle the largest, and Portland, San Francisco, Anchorage, and Los Angeles. And of course, as a new member of One World, Alaska has reach around the globe. And so, one of the things we talk about in Alaska are the hubs as well, the strong West Coast presence, but also a transcontinental presence and a strong presence in Central America, which is slated to grow. So currently, Alaska Airlines serves 5 countries. Can you name the countries? Shout them out. Belize, yes. Mexico. U.S. Canada, yes. Costa Rica. Okay. And formerly they served 2 nations. They are Russia, correct. And Cuba. Very good. You're all going to get rewards before the presentation is over. So this is Alaska's strategy today, which is a winning formula for the future. And this is what happens on a daily basis. Here you have a brand new MAX taking off on one of the 1,200 daily flights. Now we're going to take you back to 1932. And I'll tell you before we get started that you may have questions, and at the end of the program I'll be happy to answer questions, but I want to watch out for everybody's time as well. And there's a lot of information to go through. And I feel as if I've already pulled a lot out. But in 1932, the origins of Alaska Airlines are basically attributed to Star Air Service and McGee Airways. And against all odds, Alaska Airlines succeeds and thrives today. And basically what you'll see is a trend through the history of the airline, which is based on mergers, audacity in the marketplace, talent of the workforce, and a vision that others don't have. So there are also some other advantages, and the biggest advantage, of course, is geography. So this is the actual size comparison between the state of Alaska and the entire United States. So what you can see is that Alaska is very, very large. And so in 1932, there were very few roads as there are today. There were long distances to travel, and there were natural resources to be mined and drilled for and fished for. So we had gold, oil, and fisheries. And so air service was necessary to take these entrepreneurs to the marketplace. And in addition to that, so having been born and raised in Alaska, as Robert was, we know the distances because when we were just merely infants, we were on airplanes going somewhere, and that was not the average American experience. The average American experience was maybe you flew at some point in your life before you got to be in college, or you flew off to college. But not us. We did fly within days of the time we were born. So that necessity for air travel existed in 1932. McGee Airways had just acquired their third Stinson aircraft and were ready to take off. And so this is one of the main carriers that Alaska used as the beginning origins of the whole system. So McGee in 1932, and there were others including narrow air travel. So you see an S-38 as a Sikorsky in the Arctic. And here we have the plane bringing in supplies, no doubt, and probably a passenger or two. And these are very isolated regions that these airlines flew to. So this is, and I'm going to go over the fact that the airline is a combination of all these airlines fairly quickly, because in the 1930s I could spend an extra hour talking about the mergers and the acquisitions, but I'm going to fast forward to World War II, and Alaska was Alaska Star Airlines starting in 1943. Alaska was a combination of Alaska Interior Airways, Star Airways, Star Airlines, Miro Air, McGee, Labour Airways, and Fairbanks. So what you see is a network here, flown by Lockheed Lodestars, as far north as Kotzebue and Weissman and above the Arctic Circle, and my original hometown, Circle, Alaska, my town where I went to college in Fairbanks, all the way down to Juneau, where I worked for several years, over to Whitehorse and out to Bethel. So this was an extensive service. This was an extensive service in 1944, but that would all change because Alaska was changing identity from Alaska Star Airlines to Alaska Airlines in 1944, and with the change, they were starting to become a very active charter carrier because business post-war in Alaska was not necessarily taking off. There was lots of new competition. There were a lot of people coming into the marketplace, and the CAA and the CAB had basically divided up Alaska, and the original route system that I showed you just a moment ago shrunk immensely for the airline, and so they became the largest charter airline in the world post-war. And they also got a new chairman by the name of Raymond Marshall. And Raymond Marshall had an antagonistic relationship with the CAA and the CAB. So while he was running charters, he was always outside the box in terms of what the rules were for operating airlines. So some of the airline routes that Alaska flew in those days, they flew on the basis of it was Raymond's idea, so we're going to do it, but we don't have a certificate for it, but we'll do it till somebody finds out. And when they find out, we'll tell them it's another charter. Because the charter rules after the war were very loose. You could actually have scheduled charters. So he was always in competition with the CAB. And he acquired a large fleet of surplus DC-3s, C-46 Curtiss Commandos, and in the distance there you can see the first of the DC-4s. And the airline was based at Merrill Field in Anchorage. And this is pretty much what it would have looked like if you came out to the field in 1947 to look at Alaska Airlines. You'd see lots of DC-3s, crew members in uniforms. And because Raymond Marshall had such a reputation as such a cheapskate, every time something went wrong, he made them wait until they could find a surplus piece of equipment to buy secondhand replacement parts for the airplanes. So Alaska, unfortunately, had the reputation of being very erratic in terms of its schedule. And so that was something the workforce had to deal with. And when he sent this vast staff overseas, they basically had to make their way because there was not cash forthcoming from the airline, and they were in places like Ethiopia and Yemen where they were operating service, but they weren't necessarily getting paychecks or cash on a timely basis. So, that said, Alaska Airlines at home was again a fairly erratic schedule, but a pretty good network in Alaska. So it was starting to grow domestically. And then in 1951, and we'll jump into that, this is into their 20-year tenure from 1950 to 1960, Alaska Airlines finally received in 1951 temporary authority to fly between Portland, Seattle on one hand, and the co-terminals of Anchorage and Fairbanks on the other hand. And their primary competitor in that market was Pan American World Airways. Some of you may have heard of them. But the good news was that in 1951-52, we were in the onset of the Cold War, and Alaska Airlines was a primary DoD carrier for the Defense Department to haul military forces into the interior to build the distance early warning system. So there was revenue, and they got by, and they competed fairly effectively with Pan American, who had significantly more resources. So in the 1950s, there was a lot going on in Alaska, but Alaska was mainly the long-haul carrier to Fairbanks, and then on to Anchorage, and then some service, a little bit of service in South Central Alaska, and that was the entire network. And they're soon to be, in the next 10 years, they would have acquired Alaska Coastal and Alaska Airlines in Southeast Alaska and Cordova. So that was part of their growing as well. So the Civil Aeronautics Board intervened in the early 50s and said, cease and desist on operating your charter activity. So they went from being the largest charter airline in the world to being just an occasional charter. The CAB changed the rules so you had to apply and get a license for a particular charter, and it was impossible to operate the charters that they had in the past. But there's a lot written about Alaska's charter activity post-war because they were responsible for repatriating, or not repatriating, but the migration of the Jewish people from Yemen and Ethiopia into Palestine. So it's a very famous story about the magic carpet that Alaska Airlines provided. But again, they always had lots of things, and they were very opportunistic, so that was what was going on for them at the time. And back home in Alaska, they were operating, as I said, that fairly sparse system. That's an Alaska Airlines ticket from about 1952, where they still had service out to Western Alaska, but even that would disappear in time. So we'll fast forward here. This is a Merrill Field in Anchorage, which was the original headquarters and hangar, but all that changed. The airline moved to Seattle, and then in 1959, Alaska became a state, and so there was all kinds of excitement around tourism and opportunities, and for the very first time, it was possible for someone to take a vacation in Alaska and still be in the United States, and in addition to that, we were on the brink of the jet age. So there was lots of potential in the future. And in 1958, Raymond Marshall was booted out of the company, and Charlie Willis bought his share in the at Alaska Airlines because Alaska Airlines was continually cash poor, and he had married well. His wife was Elizabeth Firestone of the Firestone Tire family. So suddenly their cash problems were at least mitigated for a time. So as the 1950s ended, the DC-4s that had been operating the long-haul service from Seattle to Fairbanks on an 8-hour schedule and then on to Anchorage in an hour and a half were replaced by DC-6Cs, which were acquired from American Airlines. So that launched in that year a new chairman, new aircraft, a new livery for the first time, the golden eagle on the tail, which is still on the uniforms and the service pins of Alaska Airlines employees. And Charlie was different in the fact that while Raymond Marshall had been an accountant with a penchant for saving every penny, Charlie had a penchant for spending every single penny that was available. And in addition to the fact that he was a spendthrift, he was also a talented marketing professional. And so he saw everything as a world of opportunity. So in Charlie's time, it was about constant change and new opportunities in a marketing framework. So I'm going to go back, to that slide. Also, when the DC-6Cs arrived, he did something that was a first in the airline industry. Does anybody know what that was? In-flight movies. Alaska Airlines was the first airline in the world to introduce in-flight movies. And there was a second attraction, and that was they had beer on tap. because a major portion of the passengers that they hauled were always government employees or servicemen. So free beer was very attractive. And beer on campus made Alaska Airlines even more popular than Pan American World Airways. So, and now we're ready for another decade. So 1960, and we once arrived at the beginning of another decade with very little cash on hand, but need for opportunity. So Charlie was promoting Alaska as a new tourist destination with the statehood, and they used what little money they had to buy a couple of 1649 Starliner Constellations that were ex-TWA to put into the fleet. And then they had a little bit of money left, and they made a deal with Convair, who was in a lot of trouble with their Convair 880 because they had a lawsuit with Hughes and TWA and the Hughes Tool Company, and TWA wouldn't accept their airplanes originally, and so Convair was in this very difficult situation of trying to place airplanes. So they did something for a manufacturer that's very expensive. They started to sell one-off versions of the airplane. So Alaska got one Convair 880 and marketed the hell out of it. And so Alaska introduced the Convair 880 in August of 1961. In March of 1960, Pan American had beat them to the punch and offered the very first jet service in Alaska on the 1st of June 1960. So that was Alaska was playing catch up, but they weren't too far behind because they made this deal with Convair, but they only had one airplane, so that Constellation was often the backup airplane and operated the service. So it threw the whole schedule out of whack because the Convair was the fastest airplane in the world, commercial jet, and the Constellation, while it was one of the fastest piston engine airplanes, it still took 6 hours to get to Fairbanks. So, and the other competitor in the marketplace at the time, which was an Anchorage operator, was Pacific Northern, and I make this as a sidebar story. So they bought 720s. They waited until they were available, medium-haul Boeing airplanes, because they were also headquartered in Seattle. And so they waited for the 720s, which they didn't get until 1962, so they continued to fly their Constellations to Anchorage, which took much longer than the Northwest DC-8, which was introduced into the Alaska market at the time. So that put them in a competitive disadvantage. But more on the PNA 720s in a little bit. So a little more about the marketing of Alaska. So certainly tourism and leisure travelers were very attractive, and attracting those service guys that were going up to be working on the DEW line and at the mini military bases in Alaska. So the Convair 880 was delivered from Los Angeles to Seattle. Now I know that they're built in San Diego, but Alaska had their airplanes start in Los Angeles and come to Seattle. And they broke the speed record for a commercial flight between Los Angeles and Seattle. It wasn't a scheduled flight, but it still holds today as I understand it. So it was the fastest recorded commercial flight between Los Angeles and Seattle. And on that airplane, which was configured for all economy seating, they had lounge, they had a first class lounge, they continued to do their movies, they continued to have menus that included lots of free specialty drinks and things like that. So while Charlie was not a great businessman, he was definitely a great marketing guy. So he made Alaska stand out. The only thing he was weak on was an operational reliability, unfortunately. Now this is my hometown of Fairbanks, and this is downtown Fairbanks, and this is typically early 1960s. We had the big Pan Am office on one side of the Nordell Hotel, and the Alaska Airlines office on the other side of the hotel. And that was no accident. And I put the Constellation picture in there because even though you expected to have the Convair 880 show up from Seattle every day, it often was the Constellation because the 880 had a moniker as the hangar queen. So it spent a lot of time in the hangar to rest up, I guess. So into the 60s, this is the, and you see Western Alaska has almost disappeared. There's still some service to the Arctic, but the CAB was going to take that away from Alaska before the 1960s were out also. And so they would primarily be a Seattle to Fairbanks to Anchorage carrier. And then as they could, they got routes to Valdez and Stewart and things like that. And their growth ended up being through the acquisitions. But what you see here are a lot of gold lines, most of which were not operated. They were certified to operate from Portland to Fairbanks nonstop, but there were no passengers. So those flights didn't happen. And they flew Portland and Seattle 3 times a week to hold on to the route authority, but they were not allowed to carry local traffic between Portland and Seattle, which would have been a gold mine. They were only allowed to carry passengers from Portland to Fairbanks and Seattle to Fairbanks. That's how the CAB wrote the license. So there were a lot of constraints. In Marshall's day, he just would have done what he wanted to, but Charlie knew that the CAB had gotten much stronger, and so he paid more attention to it. So I think the next picture I have is the 880 again. This is exactly what it looked like in 1961 when it was delivered factory fresh. All white ivory exterior wings, nacelles, body, everything. Beautiful airplane. I told you about the speed record already, and Charlie, being the marketer he was, had billboards posted in Seattle that said 4 jets daily to Fairbanks. And that was in reference to the number of engines, not the number of departures. But most people didn't know that. Because if you're not very big, put your only jet vision up as many times as you can, and talk a good line. But in reality, Alaska had 2 departures daily from SeaTac, compared to more than 120, I think, today. So, no, actually, I think it's about 150 a day, but 2 departures a day in 1961 by Alaska Airlines from Seattle. And today it's a major hub. And so here we have the Constellation again, and as I said, it was a backup airplane, but it was primarily scheduled for the Arctic. But when it had to be in Seattle to go to Fairbanks, it couldn't go to the Arctic, so the service disruptions in the 1960s earned Alaska Airlines the moniker of Elastic Airlines, unfortunately. And so very, very different today. And this is a rare vision of the Constellation actually arriving in Kotzebue on a service. So there was a lot of things going on around Alaska. In Southeast Alaska, the dominant carriers were Alaska Coastal Airlines and also Ellis Airlines. So they used surplus World War II Drum and Goose and PBYs on their main line and operations. And then, and the main reason for that was, if you think about Southeast Alaska, there's a lot of water and there are a lot of islands. No bridges, very few roads, and at the time, no runways. So the runway was the water. And so seaplanes dominated Southeast Alaska. However, that was about to change as well into the 1970s. Airport upgrades were funded by the state of Alaska and the federal government, and so Alaska Coastal had merged with Ellis Airlines, and the PBYs, we would start to see them go away, and we'd start to see actual landings on runways, because runways were constructed. In addition to upgrades on runways, there were upgrades on airplanes. So the Grumman Goose was turned into a Turbo Goose. And in South Central Alaska, we had Mudhole Smith's operation, Cordova Airlines. Mudhole was an old Alaska bush pilot who started his airline in the 1940s. And he had a network that went from Anchorage to Cordova to Yakutat to Juneau. And he also served areas in South Central Alaska, and he also served one town in the Yukon, Dawson Creek. And so Cordova was doing really well with freight and passenger service, and they thrived. But they had a little gold nugget in the Anchorage Juneau market, because that was their route, and they had a monopoly. So that was their advantage. And so, while the CAB from 1960 on kept saying to Alaska Airlines, you should merge with Pacific Northern. They would say to Charlie Willis. And then they would say to Art Woodley, who owned Pacific Northern Airlines, you should merge with Alaska Airlines. There are too many of you in Alaska. But there was a long feud between Art Woodley and Alaska Airlines. And it went back to the time in the 1940s, Alaska Airlines had actually agreed to merge with Woodley Airways, which it was then, and then they reneged on the deal. And it was actually Starr that said they would merge with Woodley's operation. And he held a grudge for 30 years. So when he finally merged his airline, he merged it with Western. And Alaska acquired Cordova and Alaska Coastal Ellis, which gave them access to nearly 90% of the population in the state of Alaska. So one of the things they brought from Cordova Airlines was a lot of experience and expertise. They kept their DC-3s immaculate. They did a great job when they introduced their Convair liners. They had hot breakfasts on the flights and free pour of champagne. So they treated their customers well, and they were well thought of. And down at Alaska Coastal Ellis, they were just about to the point where they were done with flying on the water. And so this is one of the last years. Can anybody tell me where this is? I love this shot. This is Sitka, Alaska.
I was going to ask that.
Mount Edgecombe. So Mount Edgecombe is in the distance, and that's a Catalina PBY arriving in Sitka just before the airport was open. And Alaska had acquired Convair 440s to serve the Arctic at that time. So a lot of piston engine operations, a lot going on, and a few unfortunate days. Nobody was hurt, but this Constellation belly landed in Kotzebue, and just a few years ago it was still there because the Arctic will preserve anything.
Oh my gosh.
So, fast forward to 1965-66, and Alaska Airlines buys 2 factory fresh 727-100s. So here you see the delivery line at Boeing in 1966 and I think there are several things that are interesting about this. One is the first 2 carriers are still here today, and they're very large and they thrived. And everybody beyond that, bye-bye. They're all gone. So the 727s were put into service in November of 1966, and Alaska's reputation for reliability improved greatly. The CAB finally gave them a permanent certificate to fly between Seattle and Anchorage, and they didn't require an intermediate stop in Fairbanks, which was of course north of Anchorage. So Alaska could fly from Seattle to Anchorage to Fairbanks, which was far more economical and reliable. So this is right after the Cordova merger, and so they were taking the 727 around on an intro tour for the Cordova employees and the Alaska Coastal employees in Southeast Alaska. And so those are the kinds of things that Charlie thought of to do. So, and the next shot is the 727, and this is the brand new runway in Sitka. So, Alaska Airlines has now arrived in 1967, and they're just about to culminate the merger with Cordova Airlines and Alaska Coastal Ellis. And big changes are afloat, so access, as I said, access to much more of the state of Alaska for regular service, much more connectivity, but there was a stipulation. The CAB said when they were allowed to merge with Alaska Coastal Ellis, you have to continue to operate for 5 years seaplane operations. So Alaska had to continue to fly the Grumman Goose and PBYs for 5 more years, even though runways had been built. But the mainstay of the fleet was the 727. And again, Charlie's still in charge, so there's lots of marketing opportunities. This was the 100-year anniversary, excuse me, the 100-year anniversary in 1967 of the purchase by Alaska from the Russians in 1867 by William Seward. So there was a big centennial in the state of Alaska. So Charlie decided that the airline had to reflect the celebration and the heritage of the gold rush. So the livery changed from the Golden Nugget Jets to the Golden Nugget service to the Golden Nugget Jets. The Golden Eagle was just on the uniforms, it wasn't on the airplanes anymore, and there were announcements that rhymed with Robert Service poetry. And I think this is kind of humorous. Jet Gateway, Alaska Airlines Golden Nugget Jets to Alaska.
Yeah.
So that was a billboard in Seattle. And so while the jet age at Alaska Airlines started with the 880, almost a year after the 880 was sold to Cathay Pacific, Alaska bought a 990 from Varig in Brazil. And so they still had the Convair jet operation to supplement the 727s. And they're one of the few airlines in the world that operated both the 880 and the 990, but not consecutively, separately. So there was a mishmash in the fleet because Alaska at this point had 727-100s, 707s on lease, a 990 purchase that they owned, Convair liners, PBYs, Grub and Goose, Twin Otters, and the list went on. And so they had a little bit of everything, and the training for the pilots was horrendous.
Oh, yeah.
The schedules were crazy, as you can well imagine. And so then the mergers occurred, and so they had like differently equipped Convairs, 240s, 340s, and then they had 440s, as I mentioned. So Cordova had 240s, and I think Alaska Coastals were 340s, and Alaska's were 440s and 340s. So that just gives you an idea of the mishmash.
Yes.
But these airplanes must have gone through so much repainting. Because remember, they were in the Eagle livery and then the Golden Nugget livery, and there's still one more livery to come. And that one, so the Golden Nugget livery is on the Gooses now, because that was post-delivery, post-merger, that was the standard livery, was the Golden Nugget Jet, and if it was a piston engineer plane, the tail said Golden Nugget Service. And the 707 I have here is probably one of the ones that was on lease.
From whom?
Pardon?
From whom? Who did they lease the 707s from?
Oh, there's a long list.
Okay.
I'll show you a few more slides, but
Okay.
from Lloyd International, from Pan Am, from a number of airlines. So anything that was available, they would go negotiate for it. So this is the Cordova Airlines 240, and that's their hangar, by the way, in Anchorage, Cordova's hangar. And then the other thing that happened was they had so many Convair liners and such a bad relationship still with the CAB that Alaska needed to use those Convairs. They had to get more utilization out of them, so they decided that they would fly to Valdez and to Seward and to some of these small points that hadn't had regular air service. And it wasn't very successful because clearly there wasn't much traffic. But it looked good, the numbers looked good, but not the revenue. So here we have a PBY and the Golden Nugget Service livery, which is a fairly rare shot. And this is on Annette Island before the new airport is open in Gravina Island in Ketchikan. So the shuttle had to stay. And remember, it was a stipulation of the merger as well, that they had to continue to operate seaplanes. So Alaska wasn't in any big hurry to have the other runways open anyway. But you get one 727 in with 100 passengers for the destination. How many Grub and Goose shuttles do you think you have to make with a 9-passenger airplane? Quite a few. So it's like a mosquito fleet. So the other thing that was going on at the end of the 1960s was Charlie was so proud of the fact that he managed this deal with Boeing for these 727s. He went back to Boeing and said, "I hear you have a bigger model. I want the 747." So Charlie was cash poor again, and what he had worked out in his mind was that if he ordered the 747, he could resell the delivery position based on demand at a profit. And that's exactly what happened. So while they had pictures of the 747, in the Golden Nugget livery, the airplane never was in service with Alaska, but they did make money off it. So here we have a typical scene in Anchorage in about 1969 with Condors and a couple of 727s and the Golden Nugget Jet 990. And then this is, as I told you before, the acquisition and what happened to that 990. Came to Very, went to Alaska, Alaska owned it. Then they leased it later to Area in Ecuador, and then they sold it finally in 1969 to Modern Air Transport, and it was involved in a no fatality accident in Acapulco and written off. Probably more than you ever wanted to know. But anyway,
It's trivia.
and so, okay. And I have another contour shot. I guess so we can recall the one of the many liveries, or all these different liveries. And so, also at the end of the 70s, Alaska had a new hangar in Seattle, and of course the new 727s. And traffic was surging to Alaska, and so every summer there were leased 707s or to operate in the network. And this is 1973. This is a shot by Ron Sattel in Juneau. And some of you know Ron, I think, and he started out as a ramp service guy in Juneau. So, and now we go into the decade of 1970 to 1980. So there's a lot going on in Alaska. Gold has been discovered on the North Slope. Tourism is surging. Alaska is seen as an exotic location. And once again, there's a new look. And so we go from the Golden Nugget service to the, what we call the heritage schemes, which I'll show you a little more about. The other thing that happened in the 1970s was some guy went to work for him and spent decades. And that was the time that we actually bought those, we actually repainted these 720s. Now, who do you think they belonged to? They were the original PNA 720s from 1962. When Western merged with PNA, these airplanes were not fan jets. They were water wagon 720s. So they were not 720Bs. And so Alaska found a home for them. And Alaska, being very opportunistic, was always looking for this kind of a deal. Although it was a strategic error on the part of Western because they just reinforced Alaska's presence and capacity in Alaska. So, was I ever that young? Oh my God. Anyway, so I brought a shot into the 720s, and the one below is the same airplane and the one you saw before as well. Was one of those two, or I think three 720s that we had for a time. And here's another shot of it. Interestingly enough, with the heritage liveries, Alaska didn't paint the tails of the 720s, even though the red color would have been the minor, and the green color would have been, well, so this would have been the 720 with the mural on the tail, but they just had a line, a stripe. And so this is at the height of the 1972 liveries, of which there was the totem. And a lot of other liveries. So the gentleman that asked me about who we got those 707s from, I mentioned Lloyd International. That one's in the background. And one of the old Golden Nugget 727s before the paint job. And I mentioned the oil reserves. So also, in the early 70s, Alaska Airlines became the first commercial operator of the Lockheed Hercules. So they flew the Hercules because it was logistically, this was a great airplane for oversized cargo. So Alaska took this, again, opportunistic, innovative. They took these airplanes and they made the North Slope work for them. First with cargo and then with passengers. Also, at the same time, we have another 707 with a red stripe. And this is because Alaska decides that there's an opportunity with Glasnost early on to operate some service to Russia. Again, charters, long-haul charters, only in the high season. So Charlie never did anything halfway. He introduced the Russian Heritage Service on board Alaska flights. So Alaska menus, and the new flight attendant uniforms were like Cossack uniforms, big black furry hats, and
Was it Magadan?
no, that comes later. So these services, the nonstop services with the 707s, went from Anchorage to Khabarovsk in the Russian Far East, and also to St. Peter, or Leningrad at the time, which is now St. Petersburg. Those airplanes served the Russian charters. The scheduled Russia service is coming. So I'm going to fast forward to the 5 planes. So we had 5 jet airplanes at this time, maybe 6, and we had 4 liveries. So we had the Miner, which was red. We had the Onion Dome, reflecting the Russian heritage, which was purple. We had the Totem, which was green, and then we had the Eskimo Native Alaskan, which was blue. And of course, they were all outlined with gold stripes. And it was a striking livery, and this is the first time anybody had done anything like this, to do a different variation on the standard theme across the network. And I think the next carrier that did something like this, or at least tried it, was British Airways in the 90s. And so it was a great look, but the downside was people complained they didn't know what airplane it was.
And also Mexicana.
Oh, they did that as well later. That kind of was after British Airways as well. Yeah. So we still had converts into the 70s, and now they've got the heritage themes. So this is a Convair with this picture I took in Juneau, so it's with the Miner. And this is a typical scene in the early 1970s at Anchorage. And what you're basically looking at there is half the jet fleet. All on the ground at once. And of course, this is a 707 leased from Pan American. And the story about this is a lot of newsprint. So Charlie Willis always owed people money. Now, Ray Marshall always owed people money when he ran the airline too. But he owed him money because he didn't pay him. Charlie owed him money because he didn't have it. But he always made a deal. So one of the deals he made was with the publisher of the Anchorage Times. So we got free advertising, especially for print and also paid advertising, because he said to the publisher, we should put you on the board of directors.
Oh.
So we did that. So the publisher of the Anchorage Times flew free in first class on Alaska. And then they gave him lots of publicity. Charlie was very good at this kind of thing. So, but Anchorage was still growing. You know, this is not a very good shot, but you see a Western 720 on the far side of the terminal. You see a Wien 737 on the left-hand side, and you see an SAS DC-8, a Lufthansa 707, and a JAL DC-8. And that was because Anchorage at the time was known as the air crossroads of the world. Because during the Soviet era, you couldn't overfly the Soviet Union, so Anchorage was the stop. And so, in addition to those international carriers, there was also British Airways, Air France, KLM, eventually Iberia, Swiss Air, and Sabina. So a lot of service in and out of Anchorage to Japan and then also to Europe. But not very busy at that time, other than international flights. And so another view of Alaska here in the Miner scheme. I think I thought I had more others. But. So this is the 720 with the blue stripe. And this is about 1974. And so I wanted the picture of the flight attendants in uniforms on the side represent 2 things. One is those are the first men that we hired as flight attendants when the Supreme Court ruled that it was inequitable hiring when you would exclude men from a particular job category. And I always thought it was ironic that when they finally made a judgment on a case that was inequitable in the United States in the labor law, it was about men and not about women who
Oh,
had been left out of
okay.
jobs for years.
Yes.
But anyway, so the first 5 men were hired at Alaska Airlines. We got the 720s. And one of the flight attendants, and remember that Alaska Airlines was very innovative and did a lot of things on their own. So at this point, one of the flight attendants designed the brand new uniforms. And she did a great job. Her name was Ingrid Fox. And she flew for many years. And she was a gifted designer as well. But again, in those early 70s, we were always short airplanes. So there were always one-offs, usually 707s, because that would give us the flexibility to run a charter to Russia or something like that. And this is another Ron Santel shot. And so as we head through the 70s, somebody made the genius decision. Now take a close look at this 727-100 with the Native Alaskan on the tail and the blue stripe. And in 1978, we had a new marketing VP, and he said, we have to settle on one scheme for everything, and it will be the blue. And so you see where it's green and blue on the other one? The other subtle thing I think it's a little hard to see is the original Eskimo was stoic. He didn't have a smile on his face. In 1978, it was upgraded, so the green stripe was added for all the airplanes, and the Eskimo smiled. So the tagline,
Why did they just go to 1? That seems like an odd choice.
it was the same reason British Airways went back to 1, because people complained about the fact that there was no standardized identity. So there was like several schools of thought. One is you can go outside the box, one is you should stay inside the box, and everything should look like it's supposed to. Standardized branding is a big sort of mantra in the business. So this also in 1978, Alaska got their first 727-200s direct from the factory. Because remember, airplanes came from everywhere, mostly from other airlines, but these were the brand new 727-200s. The first new airplanes since Alaska had ordered the 100s in the middle of the 60s. So 12 years later, 13 years later, they're back at Boeing and they're buying new airplanes. There's also something else that's going on in the 70s that had never happened before. In 1972, Charlie Willis was deposed as the CEO. That's probably the nicest way to say it. They drug him out of the office. Anyway, so he was displaced by somebody he owed money to. And that was a realtor who owned commercial property in Alaska, and his name was Ron Cosgrave. So he took over the airline in 1972 when they couldn't meet their payroll. Charlie had put him on the board of directors also to try to calm him down about not being paid for his debts. But Ron showed up with all of his debts and said, Charlie, I own your portion of the airline. You owe me this. And in addition to me being on the board of directors, I've got the board to vote against you, and you're leaving the building today and never coming back. So, and this was sort of the story of the way things. Nobody ever retired as the chairman up to that point in Alaska. Everybody got thrown out, usually for financial mismanagement. So in the late 1970s, Alaska had finally started to make money because of the oil boom in Alaska. They were starting to make money because they were always on time. When Ron Cosgrave came in, he said, what has to happen at this airline is that we have to operate on time every time. So we're going to start with a set of flight numbers, and that flight will depart and arrive on time every single day. And if it's not, the people responsible will be in my office. So they took it one flight at a time and restored all the punctuality to the airline. So they were punctual, they were on time, and they had a high quality product. And for the very first time, because deregulation occurred, Alaska was allowed to add one new route, and in 1979, on June the 1st, they added San Francisco. So they were finally into California. And the second city that was added in California after San Francisco was,
Palm Springs.
I haven't heard it yet, Palm Springs.
Well, it was there.
December 1st, 1980. And that was my business plan that proposed it, because we parked the airplane in San Francisco overnight, and because the airport in San Francisco was on the waterfront, the airplane would get corroded by the salt water. So I had connections in Palm Springs and knew there was traffic from Alaska, and so I wrote a business plan to use the overnight airtime to make a round trip to Palm Springs from San Francisco and keep the plane in the desert overnight as opposed to the salt water. And so that was our first entry into Palm Springs, and it's been profitable ever since. And we remain.
You're still at Palm Springs?
Yes.
There? Okay.
So I am just down to the last couple of minutes here. So 1980 to 1990, we acquired Jet America, and we acquired Horizon. And as I just said, we started the decade off with new service to Palm Springs in competition with Air California, which, by the way, no longer exists.
Yeah.
So, and we also started acquiring 737s, and then with the demise of Queen Air Alaska, we acquired their 737s. So the fleet grew, and our flights to California grew with the addition of Long Beach, Burbank, Ontario, Los Angeles, San Diego, goes on and on. So this is Providenia in the Russian Far East in the years 1988. And this is called the Friendship Flight. And the chairman, the new chairman, because Ron had retired, and one of his college buddies by the name of Bruce Kennedy became the chairman of Alaska Airlines. And he thought that there were historical ties between Alaska and Russia. Well, of course, that was true. But there were a lot of families that had been divided since the Cold War. So the very first flight was to take families and reunite them after 50 years. So the flight to Providenia occurred. But Bruce's rationale was someday there'll be air service to Russia. And someday that will be an operation. That will be an operation that we can take advantage of because we know Russia. We've done that before. And as I said, we also acquired Horizon during the 80s with their F-27s, which soon became Dash 8s, which soon became some Dornier 328s, which is now all 175s. And we acquired Jet America, which was a coast-to-coast operator, so we had our first entry into Washington, D.C., Chicago, St. Louis, Dallas, and then 1990 came along. And here I said, this is me again, this is my visa for Russia. So a couple of things. I was the director of business marketing, and so I was responsible for the product in Russia. So I spent innumerable weeks in Habarovsk and Vladivostok and Magadan. We started the service in June of 1991. And in the mid-90s, we also did something else, and this is also my responsibility, but this was a fun decade. We were the first airline in the United States to let you book travel on the internet. So once again, the innovation. And then in the mid-90s, we had yet another livery change to the one on the bottom here, the blue and the midnight blue now, and a teal green stripe on the 737s. And the fleet by the mid-90s was all 737s and MD-80s. And this is the inaugural flight to Magadan. So I was going to ask you if you could guess where we were, but then there's the Russian Tu-154 right there. That's the Russian version of the 727, we're often told. Anyway, this was the very first flight. And this is my very first Aeroflot flight.
Oh.
And then we get to the 2000s, we're just closing out here. So everything is going well. Alaska is technologically advanced, continuously profitable, and growing, as I showed you in the first couple of slides. We're all over California. This is San Diego. And then we also, in 2016, we upgraded the livery again to a little more teal and more still the native Alaskan on the tail, and the word mark changed to a more modern approach. So I compare this to some of the old liveries in the past from the very beginning. And this is what we changed from that dark midnight and the odd teal to the brighter green and the 21st century look of Alaska Airlines. And of course, Virgin America was consolidated into the airline very quickly in the late 2018 to 2019. And that gave Alaska and our customers more to love. And we were all over California. This is my current home in Palm Springs, so I just have to look up and see an Alaska plane. Both Virgin and Alaska served that marketplace. And when the 321s and all the Airbuses are out of the fleet this year, and so the More to Love scheme goes to a 737-900. And we had the pandemic, as you all know. Alaska ordered 100 MAX airplanes, and they're on the delivery line being delivered now, and the industry is getting back, and the surge in traffic has been remarkable.
Yes, it is.
And I think my friend Robert has distributed bag tags with the new livery to all of you. And this is our expansion from California. Oh, by the way, I want to say one more thing really quickly. Can anybody tell me who the largest international carrier is out of Los Angeles?
I'm guessing it's you.
Yeah! It's Alaska.
Probably the Mexico.
Yes, it's about 3
and-
times larger because of their international network out of Los Angeles. So, joined One World in 2019, I think. So, global network. And all 175s for the Horizon fleet today, and the Dash 8-400s are out as of this year in January. And this is during the pandemic, everybody was parked almost, but Alaska continued to thrive because of the remoteness of Alaska. And our newest livery at Alaska is the Salmon People livery, and you're about to get the cards. That is only given to the passengers on board the flights, so you are exceptional for this fact that you have them, and you got it without flying the airplane.
How do you pronounce that?
I think it's Kakwani.
Cut.
Kakwani.
That's an X.
I know.
Oh, okay. That's just.
It's not
just-
English. So, just to close quickly, Alaska, will forever have their heritage in Alaska and its uniqueness. And I just want to close with the fact that Alaska's key to success in many ways are geography, experience, and intellectual capital from years of diverse experience, which I've just shared with you. Sound financial investment, opportunistic, a caring spirit, a local culture with a global outlook, creative marketing, and technologically advanced principles as we go along. So once again, Alaska's latest first is that they are getting rid of paper, and so they are becoming a paper-free airline. You will no longer have boarding passes at Alaska. They'll all be electronic shortly. Thank you for your patience. It's just 6 o'clock, so I guess
Good.
They all
I'm curious,
want 175.
what led to the decision to get rid of all the Airbuses?